Hello, everybody. I'm Ben Sauer, occasional Seedcamp design product mentor, ex-Babylon Health product director, and former UX designer. So I spend my time teaching UX and product these days. And last year, in response to the pandemic, I ended up writing a book chapter all about how metaphors affect technology. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, about the importance of them. And we're going to round up with some tools about how you can think and use metaphors in your product and practice. So the first thing I have for you is just kind of a question. And that is, when I say the word metaphor, what pops into your head, like right now? For me, it takes me kind of back to school. I studied The Great Gatsby, and there's this wonderful line at the end of the book. So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, our lives as this kind of struggle against the waves. And the truth is that, metaphors are, when we think of that word, lots of things pop into our head, mostly of the poetic nature, right? And then we end up realizing that actually we only thought deeply about metaphors when we were at school, like studying literature. But this way of thinking about metaphors in terms of artistic expression may limit our potential as innovators. So I want to take a deeper look at them, and we'll begin with a bit of history. So I hope you all recognize this space. Perhaps those of you who are not in the UK, this is the British Parliament. Now, what I want you to do is just observe this space here. I can't see the Q&A right now, but do you know why this gap is the length that it is? Those of you born in the UK, I'm sure, will know some of this history from your history lessons. But this gap exists in our parliament to stop one side reaching the other with a sword. So there's something here about conflict, and then it raises another question. Why was this room designed with two sides, right? The design of a political space is a political act, and this room kind of seems designed for conflict. And if you watch British parliamentary debates, that's very, very, very true. But of course, there are ancient examples of spaces that weren't designed with two sides in mind, like, ancient Greek forums, for example. Now, Winston Churchill, he actually had the opportunity to rethink the design of this chamber after World War II, but he refused it. He said that the two-side system was essential for British democracy. And you might know a version of this quote. He said, "We shape our buildings, and afterwards our buildings shape us." You might know the version of it that goes, "We shape our tools, and our tools shape us." But he said the original quote. Now, it should be no surprise that he decided to keep this as a two-sided, conflict-driven space. Because quite frankly, he was a real racist warmonger before he led the country through World War II. But let's not think it was too much about him. What about the culture that produced him? Parliamentary debates today are kind of poisonous and unpleasant to watch. I really dislike the way the culture works. So why would British politics have such a preference for conflict? Well, if you start to take a look at the language we use, and a really important answer emerges. The language we use for debate and argument is loaded with war metaphors. If you have a look at some of these phrases, poke holes in our logic, shoot down our ideas, arguments are challenged, destroyed, undermined, weakened, evidence can support, bolster, views become reinforced, fortified, cemented, we become entrenched in our beliefs. Julia Galef said, arguments are either forms of attack or forms of defense. Now, whether we like it or not, our culture has come to associate argument and debate with conflict and war. So it therefore creates this assumption of winners and losers. And it doesn't require great imagination to see how this might have quite a negative impact on how politics is done. Now, there are plenty of examples of societies that have less conflict and more cooperation, who don't see political discussion as an opportunity to win something. So if we acknowledge the deep relationship between a concept like argument and war, then we can see that our relationship to metaphors is much deeper than something like poetic, like Shakespeare. And there's a really classic book that talks about this by Lakoff and Johnson. Here's what they said in it. Our ordinary conceptual system, in terms of how we both think and act, is fundamentally metaphorical in nature. Metaphors as linguistic expressions are possible precisely because there are metaphors in a person's conceptual system. Human thought processes are largely metaphorical. Now, of course, most of the time we're using these metaphors unconsciously. They aren't signifiers of the way we think, they are the way we think. So if we want to make a dent in our world, note the use of metaphor there, we need to really learn how to use metaphors. So I want to talk about creation metaphors. And what exactly do I mean by that? Well, here's the Flickr team back in the early days. And I like to think about, like, what was on their mind? What were they actually thinking about when they created such a groundbreaking site? How did they go about shaping it? What were the concepts in their minds? And actually, thanks to George Oates, the designer of Flickr, well, she actually mapped many of the concepts and metaphors surrounding photography shown here in this diagram. And this is what she used to design the product and create all the pages. And I'm pretty sure there is no way this product would have been nearly as successful without this kind of metaphorical mapping. They were such a crucial part of the creative process. And what we see through the history of technology is that creators often choose really bad metaphors, especially in times of change. In the late 1800s, the automotive industry was just getting started. The internal combustion engine had just arrived. And you can kind of see the way metaphors played out in the imaginations of engineers and creators in these early vehicles. The cars, of course, remained carriages in their essential design for some decades, not very far from the horse-drawn variety. But the most curious feature of these early cars to me as a designer is the steering input. So even though the steering wheel had already been invented on ships, many early cars were built with a tiller, that stick he's holding. So why did the designers choose this? Well, it's because they borrowed features from small boats. They were thinking, oh, it's like a small boat. They didn't borrow from large ships because they didn't think there was a useful metaphor to borrow there. But only some years later did they realize that the tiller is actually a terrible method for steering an automobile. So new trends create bad metaphors, and it happens every time there's a paradigm shift. So let me show you a few examples. If you watch early film, particularly any kind of drama, you'll notice that it's shot like the camera is in the audience of a theatre, like you're sitting in the theatre. And this is because the creators relied on the analogy of the theatre. Oh, this is what this newfangled thing is like. Now, of course, film does share some ingredients with theatre, actors, props, and story, but it isn't fundamentally subject to the same constraints or opportunities. In fact, it took them years to work out that it was okay to edit, that you could cut between a wide shot and a close-up. The same thing happened with radio and TV. Now, one of these photos is from a TV broadcast, one is from radio, but can you tell them apart? They look weirdly similar for mediums that are so different. So radio first borrowed plays from the theatre. We still have those. And then later on, the early TV formats were based on radio with the presenter in sort of the same kind of room. Again, it took them a while to let go of the trappings of what came before. Orson Welles broadcast on radio on the right, BBC broadcast on the left. So our early attempts at the internet, particularly the web itself, are based on sometimes flawed metaphors. You know, we talk about pages. Of course, these days in our profession, we're never really after a page, right? We're after somewhere to work together quite often. You know, think Miro or any kind of collaborative product, right? A better metaphor might be like a room or a workspace. VR and AR are going through this at the moment. Notice how in the video, AR is being used to emulate reality instead of doing something fundamentally different in this Facebook concept. We haven't quite figured out what these technologies are good for. We know there's something there, and we're trying to figure out, is it games, storytelling, socializing, interactive theater? Gaming's only one thing that's really had some traction so far. We certainly haven't found the language of VR where indeed its true purpose. Now, our response to the pandemic is causing a lot of people to borrow broken metaphors too. It only took a few days, really, for the knowledge workers of the world to sort of suddenly face the fact that, oh no, this is our only ways of meeting and sharing ideas and working together. You know, very quickly, everyone knows what Zoom is. And of course, within weeks, they're sick of it. Now, it was a future shock forced upon us, but not by technology, actually, this time by biology. But of course, we defaulted to imagining what we knew already existed. for example, virtual conferences, not this one, that sought to emulate lots of the same things that happened before. You know, coffee breaks, or going for the whole day, for example, is something that virtual conferences have largely let go of. Now, where we will see groundbreaking innovation in this space is when people abandon their old metaphors. So here's one, MakeSpace, attempting to kind of really change the fundamentals around collaboration and virtual work. You know, their metaphor for synchronous collaboration is a physical space. Move closer to the people on the canvas, to hear them, to talk with them, to work with them. Now, this problem of choosing the wrong metaphor is very similar to what Elon Musk talks about, right? In no small part, he's successful because he understands the risks of bad metaphors. You know, he said, we go through life by reasoning by analogy, which essentially means copying what other people do with slight variations. Of course, as he would put it, to innovate, you have to think more deeply and draw on first principles thinking. Just a small example, in the case of rockets and electric cars, he went down into the details, examined the cost of the raw materials, and found that there was no fundamental barrier to making both kinds of vehicle much more cheap and affordable. So being unaware of your metaphors when you innovate is kind of fraught with danger. If you fail to examine the fundamental properties of something you're creating, you might make bad choices that hold back its potential. You have to kind of develop a self-awareness about what metaphors you're using. Venkatesh Rao said, it is much easier to create technology that conforms to dominant metaphors, especially when someone is breathing down your neck to build something fast. So to round up this part of the talk, I just want to leave you with a few important questions when you're thinking about making something, or in the process of rethinking it, for example. So which metaphors do you use today, right? Get a bunch of people into a room, or indeed a Miro board or a virtual space, and write down all of the things you've been saying to each other about the product, the competition, the inspiration, and so on. And then ask, like, well, how might these limit our thinking, right? Are they actually useful? A sign that they might need work is if they're very, very common analogies, you know, being the Uber of XYZ is a good one. Sometimes, you know, that kind of thing works for positioning the product with external people, but it's dangerous to use the most obvious ones in the creation process. That's kind of what Elon Musk was warning us about. You know, identify some risks. What might you blindly copy? What barriers might you not be able to break? What might you miss? And then finally, are there different or better metaphors for what we're making? You know, if you feel your metaphors are weak, or if they're perhaps not resulting in good shared understanding or progress, then maybe it's time to find some new ones. And I'm going to come back towards the end of the talk to figure out how to do that. So I'll take a sip of water just for a moment. Let's talk about positioning metaphors, like things that you use to communicate your product or your service to an external audience. And we'll start with how things are named, and I'm going to give you sort of one of my favorite examples of really terrible positioning. This is an advert from the 1980s for a computer called the Decision Master. You know, I mean, if you look closely at this ad, you know, it's hardly proposing a bicycle for the mind, as Steve Jobs would have put it, right? No one really wants to be a slave to their computer or indeed lose their capacity for thinking. But this is what this piece of marketing is suggesting. Now, a useful question to ask when a new platform emerges is kind of, is the name we give it accurate? Not necessarily that it needs a new name, but it's interesting to think about it. So is the iPhone really a phone? Speaking to it turns out, speaking to people on it turns out to be something that's pretty rare for most users. Maybe it'd be more accurate to call it a personal computer because it's on our person and it's general purpose. Of course, we've used that label before, perhaps in error. I mean, the original personal computers, in hindsight, weren't actually that personal at all. We had to go to them in order to use them. The word Facebook, in its original meaning, was a web-based university directory of faculty, staff, and students. Note the use of the word book here. Now, using Facebook today, it's clear that the product is not really used as a directory at all. What the name did do was allow students in the early months of the product's adoption to understand that it was a place where all your friends are. Now, something that it did have in common with an actual Facebook. But the kind of analogy stops there. You don't use it in the same way at all. So it turns out we don't really need accuracy in our positioning metaphors. When we're asking people to use a new thing, it is often better to give them kind of a vague understanding, a signpost, if you will. The Buddha said words are just a signpost after all. A signpost to what this thing is about and to use their existing knowledge. My favorite example is the compact disc, right? What did people need in order to relate to this new technology? Well, it was perhaps the vinyl record. Now, while these two formats share spinning disk mechanism, they couldn't be more different in how they actually work, right? Reading bits with a laser is nothing like vibrating a needle in a groove. Calling it a compact disc, however, just makes it very relatable, like a record, but a bit smaller. Now, there's a book, I'm guessing some of you read it, but it's really, really important to check it out. It's a fantastic book. April Dunsford wrote Obviously Awesome. And she reminds us not to underestimate how important external positioning is, right? Because that can unlock a market. It's a glorious possibility if you think about it, right? Same product, new label, completely different market in some cases. And she tells lots of stories in the book about how people did this, so I'm not going to repeat them here. Most of her examples are actually B2B, but actually, what that says, it's not just for consumers. Do get the book. If you take one thing from my talk, it's just get this book. It's really awesome. I will just mention one example that she gives, though, because it's just a really beautiful one that illustrates the point. Imagine you're some sort of innovative baker and you decide to make cutlery-free cake. But when you first describe it to somebody as cake on a stick, this is the picture that gets into their minds. Not very compelling. But what you made looks more like this. Frame it as a cake pop, and suddenly an actual real-world enormous market pops up, and you're selling millions of these things in Starbucks. Okay, positioning metaphors. We've talked about metaphors for naming things, but of course metaphors go deeper than that. What about the interface itself, like icons and so on? So Google Docs has, and well, until quite recently, been loaded with paper metaphors. I believe only since Google I/O last week they've started to talk about shifting away from it. But the interface, as it originally presents itself, is a facsimile of Microsoft Word. Both products introduce themselves by emulating a piece of paper. But I guess that a much smaller percentage of documents produced in Google Docs ever make it to a printer than they did for Word. Many writing products today have dropped the metaphor almost completely, like IA Writer. But if you're Google in the early days and you're going head-to-head against a word processing product like Microsoft Word, which essentially owns the entire world, then maybe you need to soften that transition for as many people as possible. It shouldn't look too different, despite the fact that its fundamentals are web-based. There's no files, there's no saving, live collaboration is the default. The use of physical metaphors in a user interface, you probably know, is something we called skeuomorphism. We forget today that the smartphone interface was new to people once upon a time, and Apple thought they needed some hand-holding. They used the skeuomorphic approach for years, strong, literal physical metaphors. Only in the 7th generation of iOS does it abandon that approach, because presumably by this time, Johnny Ive feels like there are no clunky metaphors necessary to aid understanding anymore. We'll never know the alternative universe version of that, of course. So we've talked about how things are named, how they look, but what about kind of fundamentally how they work? Now, until recently, I worked at Babylon Health, and telemedicine for years has basically been doing a lift and shift between an in-person doctor's appointment and a 10-minute appointment on your phone. But after working there for a while, I realized that you wouldn't necessarily create a health service like this from scratch, because having a 10-minute doctor's appointment for everything makes no sense, especially when I talk to the doctors. There's so many things that doctors deal with that actually don't need that approach. The future is a service where you get help that matches the health problem you have to something that can solve it, not a one-size-fits-all approach. And actually, lots of services are moving in this direction. But at the same time, I wonder if people needed the safety of what they already have before they could accept a truly different service, in the same way that people needed to accept that a carriage a car rather, was like a horse-drawn carriage and had many of the same features. So there's a bit of a paradox here, right? The metaphor of a 10-minute appointment with a doctor helps a user feel safe, but it also might be holding back innovation in that market. And for that reason, there's a difference between the metaphors we use in positioning and creation. You know, one must follow the other, hopefully. I hope you figure it out in that order. You know, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the overused quote, but it's relevant here. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposing ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. So let's take a look at an example where the function or the ideas behind the product may not have been what was actually sold. So you may remember the launch of the Apple Watch, and it was mostly about it being talked of as a watch. It was this very historical significance, timekeeping, all the watch experts they spoke to, it was all very grandiose. But we know from Steve Jobs' concept of computing as a bicycle for the mind, that creators at Apple usually have something more subtle in mind when they create something. I very much doubt they thought of it only as a watch. Now, I don't know about you, but I certainly didn't really get this product at first, although I'm a believer now. I couldn't quite see the point of the use cases when it was released, and I'd already stopped wearing a watch years ago. The features looked kind of cute, but they weren't game-changing. There was no killer app, and I didn't actually get one of these for years. So here is my theory about its true function, and this is just the theory for reasons that'll be obvious in a minute. I've got no way of validating this. How many of you have had a moment like this? You get a notification on your phone, you take a look, and before you've even thought about it, you're opening other apps and browsing social media. You didn't start with that intent, but your smartphone kind of sucks you in. It's so compelling. The Apple Watch could maybe be seen as blinders for your smartphone. When you get a notification on your watch, you aren't tempted by all the other apps because they're so limited in their functionality. I think of it like a filter, or maybe it's like a smart assistant or a guard for my attention. Show me what is necessary, but don't distract me. And we know that some of the creators at Apple were concerned by the social and personal effects of smartphones. So if I'm right and the Apple Watch was designed even in part to stop you using your phone so much or being distracted unnecessarily by it, there's no way in hell that Apple could mention that aspect in marketing. My unintentional smartphone use has dropped very considerably since I had the watch. So perhaps when they were making it, they needed to hold these two ideas in mind, right? It's a product designed to kind of unchain you from your smartphone, but they had to talk about it publicly as the next big leap in watches. Of course, a highly successful positioning, as it kind of has destroyed a lot of the watch market. So the way we think about creation is sometimes necessarily different to the way we talk about it. We have to adjust our metaphors to our time and audience. How you think about your product long term when you talk about it with your team or investors might be very different to how you choose to talk about it in public or in social media. And this is a problem I've seen a few founders get stuck on. They start to think about it only sort of one metaphor or one framing and forget that it will change over time and with audiences. So some positioning questions. I defer to April's book here. It's a wonderful book. Please do go read it. It's almost entirely about this. But have you found the right positioning, right? How do you go about establishing whether you've got a good one or one that unlocks a new market? April also advises us to leave our assumptions behind, right? Founders in particular get very attached to their early ideas. And actually what she asks us in the book is to say, put them aside and think broadly about it and figure out if there are better ones. All ideas must be considered. Don't give too much precedence to your existing ideas. I want to add something to that, which is to think about how you test it, right? Whether that's, you know, smoke tests, A/B tests, face-to-face with potential customers or users to gauge their reaction. Obviously, I'm not going to cover methods here, but you know what to do from other startup practices. And is there a difference, a necessary difference, between creation and positioning metaphors, like the Apple Watch example? I'm not saying there always is, but it's worth thinking about whether what's necessary to be in your head when you create something new is different from how you talk about it in the marketplace. Now, I've talked about creation metaphors and positioning metaphors. how do you actually go about, if you want to work on either of those two areas, how do you go about finding them? Now, what I really want to say is that despite my literature degree, I am no genius when it comes to metaphors, and you don't need to be one either. Anyone can do this if you take a systematic approach. But there isn't like a one-size-all-fits-all process, but I'm going to give you a few principles to follow. So the first thing is to get yourself in the right mindset. You know, my typical habit is to change my context. I live near the sea. I often find myself going for walks when I want to open my headspace. Step away from the computer, I think, is the main advice. And people underestimate the importance of this. Lots of creators historically have been incredibly deliberate and sort of painstaking about shifting their headspace. You know, Charles Darwin was famous for his afternoon walks. Salvador Dali, for example, used to take naps in a chair holding onto a small handbell. And then just when he was falling asleep, his hand would slip, the bell would wake him up, and he would write down his new ideas, because he had noticed that his most original ideas came in between that space between being awake and asleep. And well, we all know the quality of his strange ideas. On a more practical note, here's a lovely sort of micro game I found to put you in the mood for metaphors, which is called Rapid Fire. And it forces you to draw random connections between unrelated things. So play along with me for a few seconds. But yeah, do follow the URL and go have a look. Human beings are like monsters because they're always following you. Okay. The universe is like running a marathon because it feels never-ending, I guess. My body is like growing up because it's kind of painful most of the time. Okay, so you see the idea, right? It just pairs these random things, and it really gets you into a sort of metaphorical, figurative mindset. Generate broad ideas first, right? You might be familiar with this idea from the double diamond in design. If you take a brute force approach to generating new ideas, you're more likely to find interesting ones. Don't run with your first ideas by default. This is one method I use. I actually just draw out these big universal categories, so nature or science, and then you can start to drill down and sort of find effects or things within these concepts that you can use to keep brainstorming your metaphors. Mind mapping, essentially. You can use tools like this, random lists, and finally a slightly stranger one, but one that I have found useful in the past, is to use axes. This is taken from a guy called Richard Pope. It's an approach I really like, which is to just create yourself some axes, right? Richard Pope believes in this article that our typical process to find products is too linear, and he wants to find sort of more evolutionary biological methods to kind of expand our palette of ideas. And if you start to draw out products on axes, or indeed metaphors on axes, you just kind of plot these random points and then ask yourself, what is a product or what is a metaphor for something in this position on the axis, and then, you know, do the opposite and so on. Just a way to inspire yourself to think in opposites about things. So seek metaphors for problems. You can see metaphors in tech as two-sided, right? Problems and solutions. Now, naturally, as creators, we often go straight to the solution, and designers are often moaning at us about that. But if you seek metaphors for the problem, it actually leads more naturally. So, for example, the classic one, you know, as used by Alex Osterwalder in Value Proposition Design, is, you know, what is the painkiller to the headache, right? So you can start to think about, well, what is the nature of the problem we are solving? If we can name the metaphor for that, it might lead to more interesting metaphors for solutions. Finding your nouns and verbs, this is an easy one. If you can find them, you can think of associated metaphors quite quickly. Let's say you work somewhere where you're building something that helps teams grow, where you can think of lots and lots of metaphors quite quickly for a team, and also lots and lots of metaphors quite quickly for growth. And then you can start mixing and matching in order to find something interesting. Breaking down your elements, right? So this is a really important thing. If we think about how we describe features, almost all features today are actually a metaphor when you think about it. Something as ubiquitous as the feed. And you can use this to kind of break out of how you think about them. So if we take a feed of photos and then start to map out the actions, what are all the actions? What are all the things that people are doing in relation to a feed? And then we can start to break out into metaphors for each of those actions. You know, when we're showing an image, perhaps that's more like a gallery. When we share, that's more like a postcard, and so on and so on and so on. April Dunsford uses a similar approach to find positioning in her book, but she starts with attributes and qualities, also a very useful approach. Compare and contrast, right? It is important to think about comparisons, despite the dangers associated with them, right? Are you the Rolls-Royce of CRM to Salesforce's Ford? If you can think about non-obvious competition, it really, really helps. Related questions I've borrowed from branding exercises are, you know, if it were a person, who would it be? If it were a building, who would it be? And so on. Really just kind of go a bit nuts. It seems a bit awkward, but just push yourself to think in these different directions. But also, on a final note, you know, avoid lazy metaphors. You've got to be careful with them. You know, all too often we hear, you know, we're the Uber of X. You know, that concept in tech is already quite worn out. And consider the dark side of metaphors. You know, some metaphors have sort of hidden undesirable connotations, like the classic one, open the kimono, a horribly sexist metaphor that I really hope I never hear again. Women are not products to be ogled at after all. No, thank you, Steve Jobs. Now, it might seem very right on to mention avoiding lazy metaphors in those terms, but what you should know is that some very successful founders have been very careful to avoid metaphors they thought were problematic. So, for example, Stuart Butterfield banned the word chat when creating Slack. And I'm guessing he did that because he thought it was a sort of a signifier for cheap or throwaway conversation. He wanted a product that didn't carry all the baggage of chat-based apps that came before. And I think that his success speaks to how carefully you should tread when you think about the language and the metaphors you use as a founder. All right, so there's the principles for finding metaphors. I've also made this into a worksheet, and I'm sure the lovely folks at Seedcamp will share this PDF and the link with you afterwards. Just something you can stick on a wall to think about, perhaps. But what I want to say, just to round this talk up, really, is that good metaphors take time. You know, it's not always simple. It's not always quick. A good metaphor is worth stewing over. If we consider Richard Feynman, considered not only to be one of the greatest physicists, but also one of the greatest teachers of the 20th century, he used to spend weeks thinking about which metaphor he should use in order to explain a concept in physics to students. Now, physics is a really good example of this because it can only be understood by most of us with these oversimplified metaphors like waves, strings, and particles. And his massive influence on this field is in no small part thanks to the metaphors that he chose. So I hope I've given you some understanding of the importance of metaphors when we create these newfangled things and given you some tools for finding new ones. But I want to leave you with a quote from someone who spent his life thinking about how humans have transmitted information through history using myth and metaphor, Joseph Campbell. He said, if you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor. And we've seen this over and over and over again in our fields. Lest we forget that one of the biggest leaps in computing, pioneered at Xerox PARC, reused by Apple and then Microsoft, reached the public en masse by means of a metaphor, i.e. what we know it of today, Windows. That's it from me. I'm Ben Sauer. You can book me for a chat about metaphors or product design help you need, or just email me. I'm going to hand back to Devin.
Man, thank you so much. That was fantastic. So we're just waiting for, if you guys have any questions for Ben, please do get into the chat panel or into the Q&A panel right now. But I have like 3 things I want to ask you if you've got some time, Ben.
I do. Go ahead.
All right. Excellent. So obviously, like a lot of us in the audience are building, including me, because I'm working on a new company, are building apps. We're building software, and that software could be, you know, CLI developer tools. It could be AR, VR experiences, everything in between. But obviously, UI, as you mentioned, is like, it is a language of metaphors. Like the concept of a button, like though it is ubiquitous in modern design, it is a metaphor, right? Like we're just executing a command, but we're putting this tactile UI that we can touch, be it with a mouse or with our finger on it. And so I was curious, like, what your view is, like, as you've been studying sort of how metaphors change our perception of things and how we then can reshape them. You know, one of the things that at least in my design practice, like to do is like to really start with a blank canvas when you're thinking about, I have this business function I want to project onto the screen. Now, obviously, we have a standard toolkit, and this could be like Apple's HIC guidelines, or it could be Bootstrap, or it could be whatever. You know, it could be if you're building VR, Valve's guidelines. But like, it always feels like I might be limiting myself in the ability to express that. But at the same time, then I'm wrestling with the tension of like, it's so much faster to just do that thing.
Yeah.
How do you sort of approach that? And sort of try to avoid being cliche or too difficult?
Yeah, I think it's about being very discerning about what problems are solved and which ones aren't, right? So we don't need to rethink the button, you know, like that's fine, you know, use Bootstrap, use something's pretty off the shelf if you want to build quickly on that. But if we're talking about like how the information is organized or how the user flows through that work, that might need a new metaphor, a new way of reconceptualizing it. Now, I want to mention a field. I mentioned a field in particular that's going through this at the moment, and which is VR. So recently, I was playing a poker app in VR.
Yeah.
And in order to get to a poker table, I don't really want to call out the name of the app because I don't mean to sort of single them out. But in order to get to a poker table, I literally had to pick up a glass orb like David Bowie in that movie Labyrinth, and kind of and juggle them, and then place it into a plinth. Look at the players, you know, see if there was space at the poker table, and then select it. And of course, I'm screaming as a UX designer, going, "Please just give me a 2-dimensional list," you know?
Yeah, this has been my experience with VR too. Is it's like it's gaming but harder.
Yeah, exactly.
It just made it harder.
and bless them, they're trying to be, you know, innovative and new and original, but I think it's misplaced.
Yeah,
they're not being kind of that discerning and deciding, well, when do we actually need to kind of dial up the magic or go back to sort of, you know, very plain 2-dimensional reality. And I think understanding the difference between those two things is quite difficult, especially in an emergent field.
So do you get a feeling though, like when it's worth pushing for that sort of more first principles blank canvas approach? You know, because like one of the things you often see is you might see, I'm sort of inventing a straw man, but like a data science company being like, we got a swiping interface to validate information. And you're like, no, we just need a list. But it's like, you can see how they're trying to push it, but then they're leveraging current trends. How do you know when it's time to like, and this might be a difficult question to answer, but like, when is it worthwhile spending that time versus just saying, we'll figure it out later?
I mean, it's about the opportunity space, right? Like if you know that, wait a minute, there's a way to organize this information or these actions that could be vastly more efficient, maybe you should be pushing. I caution people against using very tactical, fancy UI methods because also in testing, like they fail, right? That poker app I just mentioned, like there's no way that would have lasted 5 minutes with real users, and they're clearly not observing it in the wild. So, but by all means push, but then be very zen about not being attached to things that don't work. Yeah.
Of course. And then I have sort of the last question is sort of the opposite side of that, which is when, and I'm glad you brought up Alex Osterwilder's work, especially with the VPC, because I think one of the things they do well in that book is really points the fact that what you need to do is focus on the simplicity of your language and get into like the core of the value. Like what's the core value, not the beautiful, elegant description, but what's the core value? And so when do you know, one of the things I advise a lot of people against is getting too complicated with the metaphors and just result in plain language. What do you do? Who do you do it for? Why is that a better way of doing it? Do you have any case studies or any stories around like when people took the construction of metaphors too far and then ended up in obfuscation in their own right?
I mean, I'd say it's pretty much almost all the startups I've been at. When you, I was with a fellow sort of product manager recently, and he was saying like, I always want to get it from like the 4 words in the founder's head down to one, you know, one essential quality. You know, if there's a lot of ands in there, you know, it's going to be fuzzy. Right. And that's not to say those qualities don't exist in the product, but when you're talking about it and communicating, as you say, you have to really, really keep it simple. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's the way I think about it.
I think so. One of my guiding lights is like, if you have to use another product to describe yours, you're not done.
Yeah.
Like, it should be a very standalone description. You have no need to have any preconceived notions of what other apps are. You know, the example I always use, you go, oh, we're the Facebook of X. I was like, what if I hate Facebook?
Yeah.
Like, do I hate your app then? Like, you're hoping that I love Facebook and experience the same way you do. It's a difficult thing to stand on.
Yeah, I mean, April talks about this towards the end of the book about like whether you're creating, space within an existing market or a new market, and what kind of framing you might need in order to do that. And so the parameters are different depending on what you're going for.
Yeah. Makes sense. I don't think we have any other questions, and we're at the end of the time. So do you have any parting thoughts before we wish you goodbye?
No, I don't.
Cool, man. Well, thank you so much for taking this time to give us a talk. We're going to share the slides, I believe, with the audience, and I think we shared your contact details in the chat. And thank you so much for that very kind offer of offering your time with our company. So hopefully, people definitely take you up on that.
Cool.
All right, cool. Well, Ben, thank you so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, everybody, it's networking time. So, correct direction. If everyone wants to jump over to the networking stage, we're going to be doing our 15 minutes of founder networking before our next talk by Louis. So I'll be over there. Some of the Seedcamp team will be there. And so hopefully we can have a good chat. But until then, I will see you all back in the stage at the top of the hour at 1600 for our next talk. See you all soon.